When I think of this game, I think of one thing above all: wasted potential. In the first few hours of the game, Vampyr certainly knew how to delight me with its dense and dark atmosphere. I was quite interested in the fate of the protagonist and wanted to find out more about this world of vampires set in the early 20th century England. Unfortunately, my initial enthusiasm was dampened after just a few hours. There are several reasons for this. For me, the most outrageous source of frustration is clearly the combat system. In short, combat in this game is a mess. It is horribly designed, neither interesting nor challenging, and at best unintentionally amusing, but at worst simply frustrating due to the absolutely disastrous enemy AI. The developers have failed in multiple ways here. Firstly, it doesn't make much sense in terms of internal coherence why humanoid enemies simply shrug off attacks with an axe or a fucking two-handed scythe as if they were nothing. Sure, for enemies with supernatural abilities, this can make sense, but for human enemies, I find it very questionable when enemies just flinch and keep fighting unbothered, even though they were just shot in the face with a shotgun. Furthermore, the game fails completely as soon as more than one opponent wants to take part in the action. While fighting groups of enemies, you are constantly attacked from behind, from above, from the side, or simply from the shadows and struck down without being able to react adequately. My favorite aspect of combat in this game is, however, how you can dodge enemy attacks and still get hit, as the hitboxes in this game are either way too large or are not updated often enough. It happened more often than I care to recall that an opponent attacked me with a flamethrower or something. I dodged and still got hit while standing far away from any fire that could have possibly hit me. I also really love the various jump attacks from enemies. Not only did the most egregious jumpers simply became invulnerable and hyper-armored through my attacks, no, due to the lovely non-functional hitboxes, I usually got the short end of the stick despite dodging those jumps in time. To make matters worse, I also felt extremely underleveled in most of the fights, even though I completed every single side quest. How can that be? Well, some may argue that you can get sufficient experience by unleashing your inner beast and suck the townspeople dry like the monstrous vampire you are. But what happens if the player, as in my case, decides to take a more pacifist approach? Meaning not to make a single NPC the victim of their bloodlust throughout the entire game. Well, the game is simply not prepared for this. Although the game constantly tells you that you can decide for yourself if you want to sacrifice a life of one of the people in town for the sake of your own level advancement, it actively punishes you if you decide against it. So it happened to me in later sections of the game that I was about 10 levels below my opponents and therefore bit the dust quite quickly in pretty much every fight. A good game would have found an elegant solution to this, so that if players choose not to sacrifice any NPCs, there would be an alternative way of gaining experience. Here, however, the player's decision actively hinders the character's development. How such a system made it beyond the concept phase in the game development process is anyone's guess. Unfortunately, the game is not convincing outside of combat either. Things happen all the time in the game's plot that had me shaking my head constantly. I don't want to go into detail here for spoiler reasons, but I have to stress that logical connections in the quests and storylines are often difficult to see. This also affects the more impactful decisions that the player makes in the course of the story. Many times it is simply impossible to deduce the consequences of a decision from the UI commands alone. I don't mean that the long-term effects of some decisions are unpredictable, that could be considered a strength of the game, but that the direct actions that follow a player input are not always clear. This reminded me of some of the worst decision-making in Fallout 4. In that game, whenever talking to an NPC, you are prompted with a series of dialogue options. However, you can only indicate what kind of statement you want your character to say, which often results in the character saying something completely inappropriate or undesirable. This is precisely how it feels with the protagonist's decisions in Vampyr. It's like the game just straight up refuses to tell me what my options actually are. This can be funny in a game like The Wolf Among Us, where glass him actually results in you hitting the other guy's head with your glass instead of, I don't know, clink glasses or something. But it's pretty disastrous if an action leads to a character's death simply because you weren't aware that this is what the game meant. Anyway, I digress, and I probably sound like a madman by keeping things this vague, so let's conclude. So what's left to say? Vampyr remains a disappointment on many levels. What the game does really well is to capture the dark and oppressive atmosphere of the early 20th century. The Spanish flu and the consequences of the First World War are reflected very well in the design of the world, the characters, and the plot. The music also contributes to this, although it too becomes very monotonous. Some of the dialogue between the protagonist and the inhabitants of the town is rather well written and impressively conveys who these people are, what their backgrounds are, what they believe in, etc. However, the absolutely atrocious combat system and the overall weak plot make it really hard for me to like this game. I had been looking forward to a dark role-playing game with a vampire twist, of which we have unfortunately seen far too little, or none at all, since Vampyr the Masquerade Bloodlines. Unfortunately, all I got was a blandly written narrative game with a frustrating combat system and non-functional balancing. What a shame. Thank you for your attention.